80,000 Roman soldiers were erased from history because two men refused to share a single map. At Arausio, the Roman commanders split their camps out of pure aristocratic spite, pinning their legions against the deep waters of the Rhone with nowhere to run. This petty distance between their tents created a fatal enclosure. When the Cimbri attacked, the Roman army didn't just break, it condensed into a paralyzed mass of bronze. The pressure was so immense that men perished standing upright, their lungs crushed by the weight of their own comrades before the first strike ever reached them. It was an annihilation where the primary weapon wasn't steel, but the suffocating pride of the men in charge. The Rhone River, on the morning of October 6, 105 BC, carried a silence that felt heavy, like the air before a fateful fever breaks. To the 80,000 men standing in the valley of Arausio, the water was merely a geographical fact, a shimmering silver ribbon that marked the limit of their world. Yet they did not realize the river had already ceased to be a resource and had become the back wall of a cage. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of wet wool, stagnant mud, and the sharp, metallic tang of bronze that had been polished for a triumph that would never arrive. There was a stillness in the ranks that was not the quiet of discipline, but the paralysis of a machine that had been assembled incorrectly. In the center of the Roman deployment, the space between the files was shrinking, not because of an enemy push, but because of a structural error in the very logic of the command. Two separate fortifications stood like islands of stone and wood, divided by a gap of several miles, a void created not by tactical necessity, but by a silence so profound it could only be born of aristocratic animosity. The soldiers watched the distance between these two camps with a growing, unspoken dread, realizing that the ground they stood upon was a funnel designed by their own leaders. Somewhere beyond the northern horizon, a sound began to bleed into the morning air, a low, guttural vibration that felt less like human voices and more like the grinding of tectonic plates. It was the chanting of the Cimbri, a sound that should have unified the Roman command, yet it only seemed to accelerate the measuring of property lines and the petty arguing over the placement of tent pegs. The sun climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows across the plain, but the light brought no clarity, only a sharper view of the trap. The Roman army was a massive weight of muscle and iron, pinned against a deep, fast-moving current that offered no path for retreat and no room for maneuver. There was a strange, rhythmic thudding coming from the rear ranks, the sound of thousands of sandals shifting in the mud, trying to find a footing that was already being swallowed by the sheer density of the crowd. The air grew hot and recycled, stripped of its oxygen by 80,000 pairs of lungs that were beginning to realize they were breathing the same stagnant air. It was a moment of perfect, haunting equilibrium, where the pride of the elite had created a geometry of oblivion that the common soldier could feel in the tightening of his own chest. No orders were given to move, no signals were blown to advance, yet the entire mass of humanity felt as though it were already falling, leaning toward a precipice that had been built one arrogant decision at a time. The river waited, the chanting grew louder, and the Roman Republic stood on the edge of a silence that would last for 1,000 years. The Roman military machine was built upon the unshakable conviction that the world was a series of geometric problems waiting to be solved by iron and discipline. For centuries, the Republic had thrived not merely through courage, but through a rigorous, almost mathematical adherence to the principle of order. Every sunset, regardless of fatigue or proximity to the enemy, the legions transformed the wilderness into a temporary city of wood and earth, a perfectly square castra where every man knew his place, his duty, and his neighbor. This was the foundation of their certainty, the belief that chaos could be defeated by a sufficiently rigid structure. On the banks of the Rhone, this logic remained the guiding star for 80,000 men, a force so massive that its sheer existence felt like a guarantee of survival. They were the heirs to a system that had humbled kings and subjugated civilizations. And as they looked at the deep, orderly ranks of their maniples, they saw a physical manifestation of Rome's eternal right to rule. The strength of the legion lay in its predictability, a clockwork organism where individual anxiety was neutralized by the collective rhythm of the march and the solidity of the shield wall. This sense of absolute control was further reinforced by the Roman obsession with hierarchy and lineage, a social architecture that was as rigid as their military formations. To a Roman aristocrat, the battlefield was not merely a place of engagement, but a theater of dignity, a stage where one's ancestral honor was validated through the exercise of supreme authority. Proconsul Quintus Servilius Caepio embodied this belief with a cold, aristocratic purity. He was a man whose name was etched into the very stones of the Republic, a scion of a house that had provided leaders for generations. In his worldview, command was not a functional necessity, but a birthright, an extension of the divine order that placed the patrician above the commoner. When he looked across the valley at the camp of Consul Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, he did not see a partner in command, but a political intruder. Maximus was a new man who had risen to the consulship without the benefit of a famous name or an ancestral gallery of wax masks. To Caepio, the idea of subordinating his ancient authority to a man of such unremarkable origins was a breach of the natural laws of Rome. This was the logic of the elite, that the internal competition for prestige was the true engine of the state, and that a victory shared was a victory diminished. The decision to maintain two separate camps, miles apart, was not viewed by the commanders as a tactical folly, but as a rational preservation of their respective spheres of influence. From a purely administrative perspective, the Roman system was designed to handle such divisions. It was common for two consuls to command their own legions, alternating authority or operating in tandem. The soldiers in the ranks found this separation reassuring rather than alarming. To them, two camps meant two perimeters, two sets of defenses, and two distinct reservoirs of supplies. It was a doubling of Roman presence on the landscape, a way to dominate the valley through sheer physical footprint. The gap between the camps was not seen as a vulnerability, but as a neutral zone where the friction of two powerful egos could be safely contained. The logic was seductive. If one camp was an impregnable fortress, two camps were a mathematical certainty of dominance. They believed that the Cimbri, looking upon this sprawling display of Roman engineering and manpower, would be paralyzed by the overwhelming evidence of a civilization that could organize 80,000 men into a singular, functioning entity. The daily life of the legions at Arausio was a testament to this false sense of security. The sun rose and fell on a landscape of perfect lines. Centurions moved through the tents with the practiced ease of men who had spent decades mastering the mechanics of war. The rhythmic sound of shovels hitting the earth, the sharpening of pylons, and the steady cadence of the watch changes created a symphony of normalcy. There was no room for doubt in a world where every ditch was dug to a specific depth and every tent was placed according to a centuries-old blueprint. The soldiers believed in the system because the system had never failed to provide them with a framework for success. They were part of a demographic tidal wave, a concentration of Roman youth so vast that it seemed impossible for any outside force to displace it. The numbers alone, 80,000 shields, 80,000 blades, created a psychological armor that shielded them from the reality of their geography. They were the masters of the earth, and the river at their backs was not a barrier, but a silent witness to their inevitable triumph. Even the reports of the approaching Cimbri were filtered through this lens of systemic arrogance. To the Roman mind, the outsiders were a chaotic mass, a leaderless inundation that lacked the sophisticated structures of the Republic. The Roman commanders believed that no matter how large the enemy host might be, it would eventually break against the disciplined, geometric reality of the legions. They viewed the coming engagement as a foregone conclusion, a mere formality that would result in a pile of spoils and a new set of titles for the victors. This was the ultimate failure of their logic, the belief that their internal order was so superior that it could withstand the external reality of a unified, desperate opponent. They had perfected the art of command, but they had forgotten the purpose of it. They were so focused on the protocol of their rivalry and the prestige of their positions that they failed to see the battlefield for what it was, a physical space where the laws of physics and the momentum of an army cared nothing for the pedigree of a proconsul or the status of a new man. The Roman camps at Arausio stood as monuments to a civilization at the height of its confidence, two squares of perfect order carved into the wild landscape of Gaul. Inside the walls, the air was filled with the sounds of a society that believed it had solved the problem of war. There was the smell of roasting meat, the murmur of men playing dice, and the steady, reassuring clatter of arms. It was an environment of profound, systemic comfort, a place where the weight of history and the certainty of numbers provided an absolute defense against the unknown. The gap between the camps remained, a silent testament to the pride of Caepio and Maximus. But to the men standing guard, it was just another part of the plan. They did not know that they were living in the final hours of a world where such arrogance was permitted. They did not know that the very structures they trusted, the camps, the ranks, the chain of command, were the components of a machine that had been set to implode. Everything looked correct. Everything was in its place, and in that perfect, geometric order lay the seeds of an oblivion that no one in the valley was prepared to imagine. The northern mist did not arrive with the fury of a storm, but with a slow, creeping humidity that seemed to dissolve the sharp edges of the Roman camp, turning the world into a gray, featureless void. On the morning of the 6th, the sun was a pale, wan disk that failed to penetrate the haze, leaving the 80,000 men of the Republic in a state of sensory suspension. The first sign that the machinery of order had begun to fail was not a cry or a horn blast, but a subtle, rhythmic vibration in the earth that the veterans felt in the soles of their feet long before they heard it with their ears. It was a low, subsonic thrumming, the sound of a world being pressed under the weight of an approaching tide. Yet the Roman command interpreted this tectonic warning as nothing more than the distant thunder of an autumn squall. The scouts, who had been sent into the tree lines days before, began to return in small, fractured groups, their faces stripped of the usual military stoicism and replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed stare that spoke of a reality that did not fit into the Roman manual of war. They brought reports of a horizon that had turned into a forest of iron and fur, of a host so massive that its campfires at night looked like a second galaxy fallen to Earth. But these testimonies were treated as the frantic reports of exhausted men. In the camp of proconsul Caepio, the atmosphere remained one of cold, academic dismissal. To a man of his lineage, the idea of a barbarian force possessing the strategic depth to threaten a Roman consular army was a logical impossibility, a contradiction of the natural hierarchy of the Mediterranean. When messengers arrived from the camp of Consul Maximus, pleading for a unified front and a closure of the 3-mile gap between their forces, they were not met with a military response, but with a lecture on the protocols of precedence. Caepio viewed these overtures not as warnings of a shared downfall, but as calculated attempts by a political rival to steal the initiative. He convinced himself that Maximus was exaggerating the threat to lure him out of his fortified position, a move that would allow the new man to claim the primary credit for the coming engagement. This was the first critical failure in the system. The intelligence of the army was being filtered through the sieve of aristocratic animosity, and every piece of vital information was being discarded because of the mouth that spoke it. The scouts' descriptions of the Cimbri as an inundation of hundreds of thousands were recalculated by the staff officers into more manageable, realistic numbers. 30,000, perhaps 40, a force that the Roman squares could easily absorb and dismantle. The sensory mismatch between the environment and the command's certainty began to permeate the ranks. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and a strange, musky scent that the horses picked up first, their nervous whinnying breaking the disciplined silence of the morning. In any other campaign, the agitation of the animals would have been a signal for immediate readiness, but here it was dismissed as the result of the damp weather and the unfamiliar forage of the Rhone Valley. The soldiers, standing in their meticulously dug trenches, watched the mist with a growing, unspoken anxiety, listening to the guttural chanting that had begun to drift across the water. It was a sound that defied the Roman understanding of music or military cadence. A raw, primeval roar that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, growing in volume until it swallowed the rhythmic clatter of the legionaries' own equipment. Yet even as the sound became a physical pressure against their eardrums, the officers continued to walk the lines with a serene, practiced confidence, assuring the men that the outsiders were merely attempting a psychological feint to compensate for their lack of tactical sophistication. By midday, the first visual confirmation of the enemy appeared, and it was here that the system's inability to process the truth became undeniable. The mists parted for a brief, formidable moment to reveal not a line of battle, but a moving landscape. The Cimbri did not emerge in the orderly blocks that the Romans were trained to fight. They arrived as a singular, unyielding mass that stretched from one side of the valley to the other, a formidable sea of gray and brown that seemed to have no end and no beginning. The sheer scale of the host was so vast that it rendered the Roman numerical advantage, the 80,000 shields that had felt like an invincible wall just hours before, pathetically small. It was a moment where the arithmetic of the Republic was proven wrong by a factor of 10. Yet the command structure remained paralyzed by its own internal logic. Instead of sounding the general retreat or forcing a desperate union of the two camps, the generals spent the final minutes of the Old World arguing over who would lead the vanguard. They looked at the inundation and saw a mob. They looked at the gap in their own lines and saw a point of honor. The first encounter occurred on the periphery, a brief, intense collision between a Roman foraging party and the leading edge of the Cimbri scouts. The Romans were not defeated in the traditional sense. They were simply erased, overtaken by a speed and a ferocity that ignored the basic rules of engagement. When the few survivors scrambled back to the camp walls, their armor dented and their spirits broken, they were punished for cowardice rather than listened to for intelligence. The system was now actively defending its own delusions, suppressing the truth to preserve the illusion of control. The gap between the camps remained open, a 3-mile corridor of empty space that looked like a path of least resistance to the Romans, but was in reality a vacuum waiting to be filled by the momentum of the barbarian charge. The air turned a bruised, purple hue as the afternoon progressed, the light failing just as the sound of the Cimbri shifted from a chant to a rhythmic, thunderous pounding. The sound of hundreds of thousands of feet moving in unison. The Roman soldiers tightened their grip on their pilums, their knuckles white, their hearts racing with a fear that their training told them was impossible. They were still standing in their perfect squares. Their ditches were still deep, and their armor was still bright. But for the first time in the history of the campaign, the order felt fragile. They were waiting for a command that would never come, standing in a silence that was being eaten away by the roar of a coming erasure, still believing that their pride would be enough to hold back the tide. The collision was not a sound of the clash, but a sound of structural failure, a grinding, tectonic roar that signified the final collapse of the Roman geometry. When the Cimbri tide finally struck the vanguard, it did not meet a line of engagement. It met a machine that was already beginning to seize under the weight of its own contradictions. The Roman legions, trained for centuries to find safety in the proximity of their brothers, instinctively tightened their files, drawing closer together to present a solid wall of bronze against the barbarian inundation. In any other theater, this contraction would have been a sign of strength, but at Arausio, it was the first movement of a self-locking enclosure. The 3-mile gap between the camps of Capio and Maximus had acted as a vacuum, and as the soldiers from the northern perimeter were driven backward, they were not retreating into open space, but into the path of the southern legions, who were simultaneously surging forward to claim their share of the glory. The two halves of the Roman army, separated by the pride of their commanders, were now being hammered together like the two faces of an anvil, with 80,000 men caught in the middle. The physics of the battlefield shifted with a terrifying, irreversible momentum. Space, which had been a tactical resource only an hour before, was suddenly the most precious and scarcest commodity in the valley. As the Cimbri pressed from the front with the weight of 100,000 charging bodies, the Roman rear ranks, blinded by the dust and the high walls of their own fortifications, continued to push forward, believing they were supporting an advance. This dual pressure created a hydraulic effect within the formation, a compression so intense that the very concept of the individual soldier began to dissolve. The scutum, the tall, curved shield that was the pride of the legionary, transformed from a tool of protection into an instrument of the end. Pressed flat against the chest of its bearer by the weight of the man behind and the resistance of the man ahead, the shield became a vice. Men felt their rib cages begin to groan under a force that no human bone was designed to withstand. The air, already thick with the scent of copper and wet earth, became a recycled haze, stripped of its oxygen by thousands of frantic lungs that no longer had the room to expand. The system was still functioning, the ranks were still technically holding, and the officers were still screaming orders that were perfectly in line with military doctrine. But the reality of the situation had moved beyond the reach of command. A centurion might order a maniple to wheel or to extend the line, but such commands were now cruel abstractions in a space where a man could not even raise his arm to wipe the sweat from his eyes. The Roman discipline, the very thing that had made them the masters of the Mediterranean, was now the mechanism of their undoing. Because they refused to break, because they refused to scatter like the outsiders they despised, they remained locked in a solid, calcified mass that could only be moved by the external force of the opponent. They were a singular organism of iron and flesh that was starving for air, a leviathan that was faltering under the open sky. The sensation within the pocket was one of absolute, terrifying intimacy. Soldiers were pressed so tightly against one another that they could feel the frantic beating of their neighbors' hearts, a rhythmic percussion of panic that replaced the drums of the field. The ground beneath their sandals, already softened by the autumn rains and the proximity of the Rhone, turned into a slick, treacherous slurry of mud and spilled wine from the abandoned camp stores. Footing became a matter of survival. Yet even those whose legs gave out did not fall in the traditional sense. The density of the crowd was so great that the fallen and the exhausted were held upright by the living, their weight adding to the crushing pressure on those who still struggled to breathe. This was the point of no return, the moment where the army ceased to be a tactical entity and became a geological feature, a stratum of humanity that was being folded and compressed by the forces of geography and ego. The river at their backs, once a silver ribbon of hope, was now a silent, immovable wall. The Roman soldiers could feel the cold dampness of the mist coming off the water, a mocking reminder of the space they could no longer reach. They were pinned against the Rhone, not by the enemy's brilliance, but by the fact that their own commanders had left them no avenue for maneuver and no way to turn. As the afternoon light began to fail, the psychological dam broke long before the physical one. The realization that the system was failing them, that their own formation was the very thing preventing their survival, spread through the ranks like a cold, paralyzing fever. It was a betrayal of the most fundamental kind, the belief that order equals life. Here, in the crush of Arausio, order was the end. The veterans, men who had survived the hardships of the desert and the mountains, found themselves reduced to the status of cattle in a pen, unable to strike a blow or even see the face of the enemy that was overcoming them. The sound of the struggle had narrowed to a dull, muffled throb, the sound of thousands of armored bodies grinding against one another, punctuated by the sharp snap of wood and the muffled gasps of men whose chests were being slowly, methodically flattened. There was no longer any talk of glory, no thought of the Republic, only the primal, desperate hunger for a single inch of space. The logic of the two camps had reached its terminal conclusion, and as the first Roman shields began to splinter under the pressure, it was clear that the only thing left to do was to wait for the inevitable conclusion. The system was still holding. The lines were still there, but the men inside were already fading, extinguished by a geometry that had no place for the living. The transformation of the Roman army from a tactical organism into a singular, calcified mass of failing matter was now complete, a process that had moved beyond the influence of human will and into the cold, indifferent realm of structural collapse. The 80,000 men who had marched to the banks of the Rhone to defend the Republic were no longer individuals with names or hopes. They had become a geological stratum of bronze and muscle, a solid block of humanity that was being compressed by the weight of its own paralyzed discipline. The very laws of the legion, the rigid adherence to the rank, and the instinctive trust in the formation had been subverted into a mechanism of collective undoing. Because they had been trained never to scatter, they remained fused together, a massive, unyielding projectile of iron that was being driven into the mud by the rhythmic, industrial pressure of the Cimbri advance. The sound of the field had shifted from the metallic ring of combat to a dull, muffled thudding, the noise of thousands of armored figures being ground into a slurry of copper and silt. There was no longer any room to swing a weapon. The soldiers were so tightly packed that their limbs were pinned to their ribs, their equipment rendered useless by the very proximity of the brothers they were meant to protect. This was the final failure of the Roman system. It had created a force so dense that it had lost the ability to move or even to breathe. As the center of the Roman formation was crushed into a state of airless paralysis, the only direction left for the mass to expand was toward the churning, silver currents of the Rhone. The river, which had been a distant geographical boundary, was now the only exit from the enclosure of ruin, yet it offered no salvation, only a different form of oblivion. Thousands of men, driven by the instinctive hunger for space, began to spill over the slippery threshold of the riverbank, their movements no longer governed by military orders, but by the hydraulic pressure of the thousands pushing behind them. The transition from the solid crush of the land to the liquid chaos of the water was instantaneous. A legionary weighed down by 60 pounds of iron and equipment was a creature designed for the solid earth. The moment his sandals lost their grip on the crimson-stained mud, the very armor that had been his pride became a leaden anchor. They fell into the deep current in clusters, their arms locked together in a desperate embrace that ensured no one would surface. The water turned a bruised hue as it swallowed the youth of Rome, the surface broken by the frantic limbs of men who were being overwhelmed by the weight of their own civilization. The riverbank became a site of absolute mechanical disposal, a place where the logic of the two camps reached its ultimate, grotesque conclusion. Because the commanders had refused to unite their forces, the soldiers were trapped in a bottleneck of their own making, a funnel that led directly into the throat of the river. The Cimbri did not even need to strike a blow to continue the annihilation. They simply had to maintain the pressure, acting as the lid on a vessel that was overflowing. A macabre chain of the submerged stretched across the width of the stream, a line of men pulling one another down into the dark, cold depths in a frantic struggle for a single second of air. The sound of the water was drowned out by the wet, rhythmic thumping of forms hitting the surface, a sound that echoed the heartbeat of a failing superpower. Those who remained on the shore were forced to watch as their comrades disappeared beneath the waves, their eyes wide with the realization that the river was not a path to safety, but the final wall of their prison. The discipline that had once been the Romans' greatest strength was now the weight that held them under, the 60 pounds of iron acting as a physical manifestation of the pride that had led them to this shore. Inside the crush, the experience was one of total sensory deprivation and mounting internal pressure. Men perished standing upright, their lungs unable to expand against the weight of the crowd, their frames failing as the formation collapsed further inward. They were entombed in open air, surrounded by 80,000 witnesses who were powerless to intervene. The air was a toxic, recycled fog of exhaustion and the metallic tang of bronze, a suffocating atmosphere that stripped away the last remnants of human dignity. There were no more prayers to the gods of Rome, only a low, collective groan that rose from the heart of the mass, a sound of structural failure that transcended individual pain. The system was still functioning in its most basic form. The men were still in their ranks, but they were doing so only because the physics of the crush left them no other choice. They were a monument to the ego of their leaders, a living wall that was being dismantled one man at a time, not by the brilliance of the outsider, but by the unyielding laws of mass and momentum. By the time the sun began to cast its long, distorted shadows across the valley, the Roman army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The 80,000 lives that had been the currency of the Republic's power were being spent in a single afternoon of systematic erasure. The river continued to flow, indifferent to the devastation, carrying the discarded armor and the remains of the legions toward a sea that would never know their names. The ground was no longer earth, but a carpet of the fallen, a topography of ruin where the only bare soil was that which had been soaked in the cost of a generation. The trap was finally shut, and the silence that began to settle over the Rhone was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a void where a civilization used to be. The logic of the two camps had been proven correct in the most tragic way possible. They had succeeded in keeping their forces separate, ensuring that when the end came, there would be no one left to bridge the gap. The river was the only witness to the total deletion of the Roman order, a liquid executioner that had finished the work started by the pride of two men who would rather see their army fail than see their rival triumph. The sun did not set over the plains of Arausio so much as it retreated, a pale disk slipping behind the horizon to leave the world in a gray, monochrome silence. The 80,000 men who had marched out as the living pulse of the Roman Republic were now nothing more than a new topography, a raised plateau of ruin that stretched from the abandoned camps to the water's edge. The noise of the afternoon, the rhythmic thudding of the crush, the groaning of shields, the muffled gasps for air, had been replaced by a quiet so heavy it seemed to press against the eardrums with more force than the struggle itself. The wind, blowing cold off the Rhone, carried no scent of victory, only the metallic tang of a generation's loss cooling in the silt. This was not a field that invited the traditional rituals of the victor. There were no trophies to be erected, no hymns to be sung. It was a scene of industrial-scale erasure, a place where the logic of the Roman system had been followed to its terminal point, leaving behind a void that no amount of mourning could fill. The most terrifying revelation of the day came not during the engulfment, but in its immediate aftermath, as the Cimbri moved through the remnants of the Roman camps. They did not behave like any opponent the Republic had ever faced. There was no systematic looting for profit, no gathering of captives, no hoarding of the silver and gold that had been the pride of the Roman commanders. Instead, the victors began a ritual of absolute, terrifying renunciation. They gathered every captured sword, every dented breastplate, and every shimmering chalice from the tents of Capio and Maximus, and carried them to the banks of the Rhone. In a silence that mirrored the stillness of the fallen, they hurled the entire wealth of the Roman army into the deep, dark currents. Thousands of gold rings, taken from the fingers of the fallen aristocracy, were cast into the water like common stones. To the Cimbri, the treasure of a superpower was not loot. It was a contaminated medium, the physical manifestation of a vanity that had made the downfall possible. They wanted nothing from a civilization that could be destroyed so easily by the distance between two tents. The river became a glittering, submerged funeral procession, carrying the discarded soul of Rome toward the sea. As the news of the disaster began its slow, agonizing crawl toward the city, the Roman world shifted on its axis. The 80,000 gone represented more than a military loss. They were a demographic erasure, a hollowed-out generation that left the Senate paralyzed and the streets filled with a frantic, overwhelming dread. The confidence that had sustained the Republic for centuries, the belief that order, lineage, and the arithmetic of superior numbers would always prevail, lay buried in the mud of the Rhone. The people did not call for the old laws or the traditional rituals. They cried out for a savior, an individual whose power would transcend the system that had failed them so completely. This was the moment the Republic faded, long before the first Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The rise of Marius, the restructuring of the legions, and the eventual end of the Senate's authority were all born here, in the cold, silent aftermath of a moment where the only thing that mattered was the space a man needed to breathe. The distance between the two camps remained a phantom scar on the landscape, a 3-mile monument to the pride of two men who had preferred the loss of an army to the success of a rival. The Rhone continued to flow, indifferent to the fact that it had become the largest resting place in the history of the Mediterranean. The water washed over the silver and the bronze, the current slowly burying the evidence of Rome's greatest shame beneath layers of silt and time. There were no messengers riding to report a setback because there was no one left to report. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that covered the plains where 80,000 lives had been extinguished in a single afternoon. It was not a defeat that could be avenged or a mistake that could be corrected. It was a moment of finality, a point of no return where the old world ended and a new, more desperate era began. The sun was gone, the river was dark, and the only thing that remained was the terrifying truth that a civilization could be erased not by the strength of its enemies, but by the weight of its own unyielding arrogance. The trap was empty, the soldiers were gone, and the Republic was a ghost, haunting the banks of a river that would never forget the taste of Roman iron.